Around 1178 BC, a fleet of warships appeared on the horizon of the Egyptian coast. The ships were unlike anything the Egyptians had seen before. High-prowed vessels with square sails, manned by warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses, carrying swords and round shields of a type that were foreign to the Nile Valley. The ships were not alone. Behind them, along the coast road, a vast army was moving. Families in ox carts, warriors on foot, women and children mixed with soldiers, a migration as much as an invasion, an entire population on the move, sweeping southward through the Levant, destroying the Hittite Empire, sacking the cities of the Syrian coast, and bearing down on Egypt with the force of a civilization in collapse. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. Modern historians call them the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders and migrants whose origins are still debated and whose campaigns contributed to the catastrophic collapse of Bronze Age civilization across the eastern Mediterranean. They had already destroyed the Hittites. They had already sacked Ugarit. They had already burned their way through the Levantine coast. Egypt was the last major civilization still standing, and the pharaoh who stood between the Sea Peoples and the destruction of Egypt was Ramesses III, the last great warrior king of the new kingdom, the last pharaoh who would fight a battle of genuinely civilizational significance. Ramesses I. He met the Sea Peoples in a combined land and naval battle, in the eastern delta and on the waters of the Nile, and he defeated them. The naval battle, fought in the channels of the delta, was one of the first recorded naval engagements in history. The Egyptian archers, positioned on the riverbank, poured arrows into the Sea People's ships, while Egyptian vessels rammed and capsized the enemy fleet. The enemy sailors, thrown into the water, were dragged from the Nile and killed or captured. The invasion was broken, Egypt was saved, and Ramesses III, the pharaoh, who had defeated the force that had destroyed every other civilization in the eastern Mediterranean, built a temple to commemorate his victory. That temple is Medinet Habu. It is the best preserved mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile. Its walls still stand, its reliefs still retain their original paint, its battle scenes, depicting the defeat of the Sea Peoples in the most detailed military art of the ancient world, are still legible, still vivid, still telling the story of the battle that saved Egypt from the fate that destroyed the Bronze Age. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why Medinet Habu was built as a fortress, as much as a temple, what the Sea People's battle reliefs tell us about the catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age, how the temple served as a refuge during centuries of political collapse, and why the best-preserved mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis is, paradoxically, the one that was built at the very end of the era it represents. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Ramesses III ruled Egypt for approximately 31 years, from roughly 1186 to 1155 BC. He was the second pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, the son of Setnakat, who had seized the throne after a period of political chaos at the end of the 19th dynasty. Ramesses III inherited a kingdom that was under threat, threatened from the west by Libyan tribal confederations that were pressing into the delta, threatened from the east by the Sea Peoples who were sweeping through the Levant, and threatened from within by economic instability, administrative corruption, and the declining authority of the pharaonic state. Ramesses responded to these threats with military force and architectural ambition. He fought 3 major military campaigns, 2 against the Libyans in his 5th and 11th years, and 1 against the Sea Peoples in his 8th year, and he commemorated all 3 on the walls of the temple that would become his greatest monument. The temple was designed to accomplish 2 objectives simultaneously: to serve as his mortuary temple, the building where his cult would be maintained after his death, and to serve as a fortress, a fortified complex that could shelter the Theban population during military emergencies. The complex covers approximately 66,000 square meters, roughly 8 hectares, making it one of the largest temple complexes in the Theban necropolis. The complex includes the main mortuary temple, roughly 150 meters long, a royal palace, a small temple of Amun, originally built by Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III in the 18th dynasty, chapels of the gods' wives of Amun, added during the 25th and 26th dynasties, a sacred lake, administrative buildings, storerooms, and an extensive mud brick enclosure wall that surrounds the entire complex. The enclosure wall, roughly 10 meters high and several meters thick, gives the complex its fortress-like character, transforming the temple from a sacred precinct into a fortified compound. The entrance to the complex is through the Migdol Gate, a massive fortified gateway, roughly 22 meters high, modeled on the Syrian Migdol fortresses that Ramesses had encountered during his military campaigns. The word Migdol comes from a Semitic word meaning tower or fortress, and the gate's design, with its flanking towers, its narrow entrance passage, and its defensive crenellations, is a deliberate architectural quotation from the military architecture of the Levant. The Migdol Gate was a statement, a declaration that the pharaoh who had defeated the invaders from the north had appropriated their architectural language, had taken their fortress design and made it his own, had transformed the enemy's weapon into a monument of Egyptian triumph. The main temple of Ramesses III follows the standard plan of New Kingdom mortuary temples, the same plan that his predecessor Sir Ramesses II had used for the Ramesseum, and that Ramesses III consciously imitated. The plan includes 2 pylons, massive trapezoidal gateways, 2 open courtyards, a hypostyle hall, and a series of inner sanctuaries dedicated to the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the Theban triad, and to the deified Ramesses himself. The temple measures roughly 150 meters in length, comparable to the Ramesseum and to the other major mortuary temples of the Theban necropolis. But the preservation is exceptional. Medinet Habu is the best preserved mortuary temple on the West Bank, better preserved than the Ramesseum, better preserved than the temple of Amenhotep III, which is almost entirely destroyed, better preserved than the temple of Seti I at Thebes, which has been reduced to its foundations. The walls of Medinet Habu are still standing, the pylons are still intact, the hypostyle hall retains many of its columns, and the reliefs, the extraordinary carved and painted reliefs that cover more than 7,000 square meters of wall surface, still retain traces of their original color, providing one of the most complete records of New Kingdom temple decoration that survives from any site in Egypt. The core problem of Medinet Habu is the problem of ending, the problem of a temple that was built at the end of an era that commemorated the last great military victory of the New Kingdom, and that would witness, within its own walls, the collapse of the civilization that built it. Ramesses III was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. His military victories against the Libyans and the Sea Peoples were genuine achievements, genuine demonstrations of Egyptian military power, genuine defenses of the Egyptian state against existential threats, but they were also the last of their kind. After Ramesses III, no Egyptian pharaoh would fight a battle of comparable significance. After Ramesses III, no Egyptian pharaoh would build a mortuary temple of comparable scale. After Ramesses III, the New Kingdom, the era of empire, of military expansion, of colossal building programs, would enter a long, slow decline that would end, roughly a century after his death, in the fragmentation of the Egyptian state. The decline was already visible during Ramesses's own reign. The famous strikes of the Theban workmen, the workers who cut and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, occurred during the final decade of Ramesses's reign, when the ration deliveries from the royal granaries failed to arrive on time. The strikes, documented in papyri from Deir el-Medina, were symptoms of a systemic failure, the failure of the administrative and economic system that had sustained the New Kingdom for 3 centuries. The granaries were short, the deliveries were late, the workers who depended on the system for their daily bread stopped working. The system was breaking down, and it gets worse. Ramesses III was assassinated. The Harem Conspiracy, a plot orchestrated by one of his minor wives, Djahy, who sought to place her son Pentuer on the throne, resulted in the pharaoh's murder. The judicial papyrus that records the trial of the conspirators, the most detailed account of a political assassination in ancient Egyptian history, names more than 30 individuals who were involved in the plot, including members of the royal household, military officers, and court officials. The conspiracy was discovered. The conspirators were tried, convicted, and punished. Some were executed, others were allowed to commit suicide. But the pharaoh was dead. The last great king of the new kingdom was murdered by his own court. The assassination of Ramesses III is the defining event of the temple's history. The moment when the builder of the fortress temple was destroyed by enemies not from the north or the west, but from within his own household. The irony is devastating. The pharaoh who defeated the Sea Peoples, the most dangerous external threat that Egypt had faced in centuries, was killed by his own wife. The pharaoh who built a fortress temple to protect Egypt from foreign invasion was murdered inside the fortress he built. The walls held, the defenses worked. The enemy that destroyed the pharaoh was already inside. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The temple survived the pharaoh's death. It survived the decline of the 20th dynasty. It survived the fragmentation of the Egyptian state during the Third Intermediate Period. It survived the Libyan invasions that drove the Theban population to seek shelter within its fortified walls. And it survived the centuries of subsequent occupation. The Coptic Christian settlement that was built within the temple precinct, the medieval village that grew up inside its enclosure wall, the gradual transformation of the temple from a sacred space into a habitable fortress. Medinet Habu survived because it was built to survive, because its fortified design, its massive enclosure wall, its elevated position on the edge of the desert, made it the most defensible location in the Theban necropolis. The temple was a fortress, and the fortress outlasted the civilization that built it. The Sea People's Crisis, the event that the Medinet Habu reliefs document with such extraordinary visual detail, was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a catastrophe that had been building across the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The late 13th and early 12th centuries BC saw a cascade of interconnected collapses: the fall of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of the Mycenaean palace civilizations, the sacking of major trading cities along the Levantine coast, the disruption of the international trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age economic system, and the widespread abandonment of urban settlements across the eastern Mediterranean. The causes of this cascade are still debated by scholars. The explanations that have been proposed include climate change, a prolonged drought that may have undermined agricultural production across the region, earthquake storms, a series of seismic events that may have damaged multiple cities simultaneously, internal social upheaval, revolts by peasant populations against the palace elites who controlled the means of production, and the Sea People's invasions themselves, which may have been both a cause and a consequence of the broader collapse. The most widely accepted view is that the collapse was caused by a combination of these factors, a perfect storm of environmental, military, social, and economic pressures that overwhelmed the interconnected civilizational system of the late Bronze Age. The reliefs at Medinet Habu provide the Egyptian perspective on this catastrophe. And the Egyptian perspective is unique, because Egypt was the only major civilization that survived. The Hittites left no account of their destruction. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned, its archives scattered, its records largely lost. The Mycenaeans left no account of their collapse. Their palaces were destroyed, their Linear B script fell out of use, and the oral traditions that preserved the memory of the collapse were not written down for centuries. The Levantine city-states left fragmentary accounts. The last letter from the king of Ugarit, desperately requesting military assistance against an approaching enemy fleet, is one of the most haunting documents of the Bronze Age. But these accounts are brief, fragmentary, and incomplete. Only Egypt left a comprehensive account. And that account is at Medinet Habu, carved on the walls of a mortuary temple, in the most detailed military reliefs of the ancient world, by the artists of a pharaoh who had actually fought the Sea Peoples and who had defeated them. The Medinet Habu reliefs are not merely art, they are history, the primary source for one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the ancient world, and the temple that contains them, The fortress temple, the victory monument, the last great building of the new kingdom, is the archive of the end of the Bronze Age. The archaeological evidence from sites across the eastern Mediterranean confirms the scale of the catastrophe. Cities that had flourished for centuries were destroyed, burned, sacked, abandoned. The destruction layer, the stratum of ash, rubble, and debris that marks the end of occupation at a site, is visible at dozens of sites across the eastern Mediterranean, from Greece to Anatolia to Syria to Canaan. The destruction was comprehensive. The destruction was simultaneous, within a few decades, and the destruction was terminal. The cities that were destroyed were, in most cases, never reoccupied. The Bronze Age civilizations did not recover, they did not rebuild, they simply ended, and the world that followed them, the Iron Age, the age of the Greek city-states, the age of the Hebrew kingdoms, the age of the Phoenician traders, was a fundamentally different world, built on different foundations, governed by different institutions, populated by different peoples. Ramesses III's victory over the Sea Peoples was, in this context, an act of civilizational survival. Every other major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean had fallen. Egypt alone survived, and the pharaoh who ensured Egypt's survival, who met the Sea Peoples in battle, who defeated them on land and at sea, who preserved the last functioning state of the Bronze Age, was Ramesses III. His victory did not save the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was already dead, destroyed by the cascade of collapses that had consumed the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Levantine city-states. But the victory saved Egypt, preserved the Egyptian state, the Egyptian religion, the Egyptian cultural tradition for another 1,000 years of independent existence. The numbers are striking. The Battle of the Delta, the naval engagement depicted on the north wall of the temple, involved, according to the Egyptian sources, a substantial fleet of enemy vessels, each one carrying warriors and their equipment. The Egyptian response was comprehensive, a mobilization of the entire Egyptian military establishment, including the army, the navy, and the frontier defense forces. The battle was fought in the channels of the Eastern Delta, a geography that favored the Egyptians, who knew the waterways and who could position their archers on the riverbanks to fire into the enemy ships. The Sea Peoples, accustomed to open sea warfare, were trapped in the narrow channels, unable to maneuver, unable to use their superior sailing skills, sitting targets for the Egyptian archers. The depiction of the naval battle at Medinet Habu is the most detailed representation of ancient naval warfare that survives from any source, more detailed than the Greek depictions of the Battle of Salamis, more detailed than the Roman depictions of the Battle of Actium. The reliefs show every element of the engagement, the formation of the Egyptian fleet, the approach of the enemy vessels, the ramming, the boarding, the capsizing, the drowning. The Egyptian archers are depicted standing on the ship's decks, firing volleys of arrows into the enemy vessels. The Sea People's sailors, hit by the arrows, fall from the rigging. The capsized ships spill their crews into the water. The Egyptian soldiers, wading in the shallows, drag the drowning sailors from the Nile and kill them with swords and spears. The violence of the reliefs is striking. The Medinet Habu battle scenes are among the most graphically violent compositions in Egyptian art, depicting the killing of enemies, the severing of hands, the Egyptian method of counting the dead, the impaling of captives, and the presentation of severed body parts to the pharaoh as trophies of war. The violence is not gratuitous. It is ritualistic, a visual performance of the pharaoh's role as the defender of cosmic order, the destroyer of chaos, the champion of Mat against the forces of Isfet. The violence is theological. And the theology of a pharaoh who destroys the enemies of order, who maintains the cosmic balance through the exercise of sanctioned violence, is the fundamental ideology of Egyptian kingship. The Migdol Gate's upper rooms, the intimate chambers above the fortress gateway, decorated with reliefs showing Ramesses in the company of young women, have generated considerable scholarly debate. The scenes show the pharaoh in an informal setting, playing board games, receiving flowers and fruit, engaged in activities that are strikingly different from the martial imagery that dominates the rest of the temple. The scenes have been interpreted in several ways, as depictions of the pharaoh's harem life, as representations of his relationship with the goddess Hathor, who is associated with love and beauty, or as scenes of the pharaoh's afterlife in a paradise of sensual pleasure. The interpretation remains uncertain, and the juxtaposition of the intimate upper rooms with the martial lower gateway is one of the most puzzling architectural features at Medinet Habu. The royal palace that was attached to the south side of the first courtyard, accessible through a doorway in the courtyard wall, was a ceremonial structure similar in function to the royal palace at the Ramesseum. The palace included a throne room, a window of appearances, a ceremonial window through which the pharaoh could appear to his subjects in the courtyard below, and a suite of auxiliary chambers for the pharaoh's use during visits to the temple. The window of appearances is a distinctive architectural feature, a projecting balcony overlooking the courtyard from which the pharaoh could address crowds, reward loyal officials, and display the captured enemies and the plundered goods of his military campaigns. Walk through Medinet Habu as a visitor would, from the Migdol Gate, through the courtyards, into the hypostyle hall, and through to the inner sanctuaries. The approach to the temple is dramatic. The Migdol Gate, the fortified entrance, with its flanking towers and its narrow passage, rises from the desert floor like a piece of military architecture transplanted from the Levantine frontier. The gate's upper rooms, accessible by internal staircases, were decorated with reliefs showing Ramesses in intimate scenes with female attendants. Scenes that have been interpreted as depicting the pharaoh's private life in a suite of rooms that may have served as a royal retreat. The contrast between the military exterior and the intimate interior is striking. A fortress on the outside, a palace on the inside. Pass through the Migdol Gate and enter the temple precinct. To the right stands the small Temple of Amun, a modest structure, originally built by Hatshepsut and Thutmose III during the 18th dynasty, roughly 3 centuries before Ramesses III began his construction. The small temple was already ancient when Ramesses built his mortuary temple beside it, and its presence at the site may have been one of the reasons that Ramesses chose this location, connecting his mortuary temple to the sacredness of an already established cult center. Approach the main temple through the first pylon, the massive trapezoidal gateway, roughly 25 meters high, decorated with colossal reliefs showing Ramesses smiting enemies before the gods. The first pylon at Medinet Habu is one of the best preserved pylons in the Theban necropolis, its surfaces largely intact, its reliefs legible, its scale impressive. The reliefs on the exterior face of the pylon show the pharaoh in the conventional smiting pose, grasping a group of captive enemies by the hair, raising his mace to strike, performing the ritual destruction of Egypt's enemies before the approving gaze of the gods. Enter the first courtyard. The space is large, open and flanked on the south side by a colonnade with engaged statues of Ramesses in the Osirid posture, standing against the pillars, arms crossed, wearing the regalia of the dead god. The north wall of the courtyard bears some of the most famous reliefs at Medinet Habu, the scenes of the Libyan campaigns, showing the pharaoh charging into the enemy ranks in his chariot, the Libyan warriors falling before him, the captives being led in triumph to the pharaoh's presence. Pass through the second pylon into the second courtyard. This courtyard is smaller, more enclosed, and more richly decorated than the first. Its walls bear the reliefs of the Sea People's battles, the most historically significant images at the site, and among the most important documents of the Bronze Age collapse. The Sea People's reliefs are divided into 2 main compositions. The first, the land battle, sometimes called the Battle of Djahy, shows the Egyptian army engaging the Sea People's land forces on the coastal plain of the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples are depicted with their distinctive headgear, feathered headdresses, horned helmets, and their round shields and long swords, which are different from the Egyptian weaponry, and which identify them as foreigners from the Aegean or the Western Mediterranean. The battle scene shows the Egyptian chariots crashing into the enemy ranks, the Sea People's ox carts being overturned, the women and children of the migrating population caught in the chaos of the battle. The second composition, The naval battle, the Battle of the Delta, is the most extraordinary. It shows the Egyptian fleet engaging the Sea People's ships in the channels of the Nile Delta. The Egyptian vessels, low, sleek, oar-driven warships, are ramming the enemy's high-prowed sailing ships, capsizing them, throwing their crews into the water. Egyptian archers, positioned on the ships and on the riverbank, pour arrows into the enemy vessels. The Sea People's sailors, thrown into the water, are being dragged out and killed or captured by Egyptian soldiers. The scene is one of the most vivid and most detailed depictions of naval warfare in the ancient world. A visual record of a battle that determined the fate of the last surviving Bronze Age civilization. The Libyan campaigns of Ramesses III, fought in his 5th and 11th years, are depicted on the walls of the first courtyard and on the exterior walls of the temple. The Libyans, tribal peoples who inhabited the desert region west of the Nile Delta, had been pressing into Egyptian territory for decades. Attracted by the fertile land of the Delta and by the economic opportunities that the declining Egyptian state was increasingly unable to defend. Ramesses III's predecessors had fought the Libyans as well. Ramesses II and Meremptah had both conducted campaigns against Libyan incursions. But the Libyan pressure intensified during the 20th dynasty, and Ramesses III's 2 Libyan campaigns, each involving large-scale military operations against substantial tribal confederations, were the most ambitious Egyptian responses to the Libyan threat. The reliefs depicting the Libyan campaigns show the standard elements of Egyptian military propaganda: the pharaoh in his chariot, the enemy in flight, the captives being led before the throne, the severed hands being counted to tally the dead. But the reliefs also include details that are specific to the Libyan campaigns. The distinctive clothing and hairstyles of the Libyan warriors, the tattoos that marked the Libyan tribal affiliations, the feathered headdresses and leather garments that distinguished the Libyans from the Egyptian troops. The reliefs are ethnographic as well as military. They provide visual information about the appearance and the material culture of the Libyan peoples that is not available from any other source. The temple's hypostyle hall, located beyond the second courtyard, at the center of the temple's axial plan, originally contained 48 columns, arranged in rows, supporting a stone roof. The hall follows the same general design as the hypostyle halls at the Ramesseum and at Karnak, central columns taller than the surrounding ones, creating a clerestory that admitted light through the gap between the high central ceiling and the lower side aisles. Many of the columns are still standing, and portions of the ceiling are still in place, supporting traces of the original painted decoration, including coloured representations of divine figures, hieroglyphic texts, and astronomical motifs. The painted decoration at Medinet Habu is one of the temple's most remarkable features, and one of the most important for understanding the original appearance of New Kingdom temples. Most Egyptian temples have lost their painted decoration. The pigments have faded, flaked, or been washed away by centuries of exposure to the elements. At Medinet Habu, the painted decoration survives in significantly better condition than at most other sites. The deep, vivid colours of the original paint are visible on many surfaces, particularly in the protected interior spaces where the stone was shielded from direct sunlight and from moisture. The colours are extraordinary. The deep blue of the celestial ceiling, representing the night sky, is still vivid. The red-brown of the flesh tones is still warm. The green of the vegetation motifs is still fresh. The yellow of the gold accents is still bright. The colours transform the visitor's understanding of the temple, converting the monochrome stone ruin that most Egyptian temples present into a polychromatic spectacle that approaches the temple's original appearance. The experience of seeing an Egyptian temple with its original colour is qualitatively different from the experience of seeing the same temple without colour. The colour brings the reliefs to life, gives them depth, warmth, and a visual richness that the uncoloured stone cannot achieve. The inner sanctuaries of the temple, located behind the hypostyle hall at the western end of the axis, are dedicated to the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the Theban triad, and to the deified Ramesses III. The sanctuaries are small, dark, and richly decorated, each one a miniature world enclosed by carved walls, covered by painted ceilings, designed to house the cult statue of the deity it served. The sanctuaries are among the best preserved interior spaces at Medinet Habu. Their walls intact, their relief legible, their painted surfaces partially preserved. The mortuary suite, a series of 8 rooms within the temple dedicated to the funerary process of Ramesses III, contains reliefs that depict the pharaoh's transformation from a living king into an Osiris deity. The reliefs show the various stages of the funerary process: the washing of the body, the wrapping in linen, the performance of the opening of the mouth ceremony, the presentation of offerings, the recitation of the funerary texts. The mortuary suite is the theological heart of the temple, the space where the transition from Horus to Osiris, from the living king to the dead god, was ritually enacted. The festival calendar at Medinet Habu, inscribed on the temple's walls, is one of the most detailed surviving records of the Egyptian religious year. The calendar lists the dates, the rituals, and the offerings associated with each major festival in the temple's liturgical cycle, including the festival of Amun, the festival of Min, the festival of Sokar, and the beautiful festival of the Valley. The calendar provides information about the quantity and the type of offerings required for each festival, the numbers of cattle, geese, loaves of bread, jars of beer, and bundles of vegetables that the temple's administrative staff was responsible for procuring and presenting. The administrative documents associated with the Medinet Habu complex, ostraca and papyri discovered in the temple's storerooms and in the surrounding area, provide detailed information about the temple's economic operations. The documents record the delivery of grain, the distribution of rations, the payment of workers, and the management of the temple's agricultural estates. The documents are bureaucratic. They record the mundane, day-to-day operations of a large institution, the kind of information that is rarely preserved in monumental inscriptions, but that is essential for understanding how the temple actually functioned. The administrative record reveals a temple that was, at its peak, a major economic institution, an employer of hundreds of workers, a consumer of enormous quantities of grain and other agricultural products, a producer of manufactured goods, bread, beer, linen, sandals, and a redistributor of wealth from the temple's agricultural estates to the population that depended on the temple for their livelihood. The economic scale of Medinet Habu was comparable to the economic scale of the Ramesseum. Each temple was, in modern terms, a medium-sized corporation, employing hundreds of people, managing multiple agricultural estates, and operating a complex system of production, storage, and distribution. The relationship between Medinet Habu and the Ramesseum is one of the most instructive architectural comparisons in the Theban necropolis. The two temples are roughly the same size. They follow roughly the same plan. They were built by pharaohs of the same dynasty, using the same construction techniques, employing the same types of craftsmen. Ramesses III consciously modelled his temple on his predecessors, adopting the Ramesseum's plan, imitating its decorative program, and attempting to match its scale. And yet the two temples have survived in dramatically different conditions. The Ramesseum is a ruin. Medinet Habu is largely intact. The difference: a few meters of elevation, a more defensible location, a thicker enclosure wall, has determined the fate of two buildings that were, in every other respect, comparable. The comparison teaches a lesson that is as relevant to modern architecture and urban planning as it is to Egyptology. The survival of a building is not determined by the quality of its construction or the ambition of its builder. It is determined by the specific conditions of its site: the elevation, the hydrology, the seismicity, the defensibility, the accessibility to potential quarriers and vandals. Medinet Habu was built on higher ground. The Ramesseum was built on lower ground. The higher ground survived. The lower ground did not. And the lesson that site selection is destiny, that location determines survival, that the most important architectural decision is not what to build but where to build it, is written in the contrasting fates of two temples that were, in every respect except location, identical. The 18th dynasty small temple of Amun, located within the Medinet Habu precinct, to the right of the Migdol Gate, is one of the oldest structures at the site and one of the most historically significant. The temple was originally built by Queen Hatshepsut around 1470 BC and was subsequently expanded and modified by her successor Thutmose III. The temple is dedicated to the god Amun in his form as a primordial creator deity, the god who, according to Theban theology, created the world through the power of his voice, and who continued to sustain the cosmos through his ongoing creative activity. The small temple's presence at Medinet Habu establishes the site's sacred status as predating Ramesses III by more than 3 centuries. Ramesses did not build on virgin ground. He built on ground that had already been consecrated by the most important pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, by Hatshepsut, who was one of the most successful rulers of the New Kingdom, and by Thutmose III, who was the most successful military pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. By building his mortuary temple beside the 18th dynasty temple, Ramesses was connecting himself to the prestige and the sanctity of the earlier dynasty, claiming, through architectural association, the legitimacy that the proximity to a sacred site could provide. The chapels of the gods' wives of Amun, small funerary chapels located within the Medinet Habu precinct, built during the 25th and 26th dynasties, roughly the 8th to the 6th centuries BC, add another layer of historical significance to the site. The gods' wives of Amun were high-ranking priestesses, women of the royal family who served as the earthly consorts of the god Amun and who wielded considerable political and economic power in the Theban region. The chapels, which were built to house the funerary cults of these powerful women, demonstrate that Medinet Habu continued to function as a religious center for more than 5 centuries after the end of the New Kingdom. A continuity of sacred use that is remarkable and that reflects the enduring prestige of the site. The sacred lake at Medinet Habu, located in the southeast corner of the precinct, served the ritual function that sacred lakes served at all Egyptian temples. It provided the purified water that the priests used for their daily ablutions and for the preparation of the sacred offerings. But the sacred lake at Medinet Habu also served a specifically gendered function. According to ancient sources, women came to the lake to bathe and to pray for fertility, invoking the creative power of Amun, who was worshipped at the site in his form as a god of fertility, to grant them children. The practice connects Medinet Habu to the broader tradition of fertility worship that was associated with the Theban temples, a tradition that was maintained, in various forms, from the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The documentation of Medinet Habu by Western scholars began with the Napoleonic expedition of 1798 to 1801 and has continued in increasingly systematic form ever since. The most important scholarly contribution was made by the Epigraphic Survey of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, which began documenting the temple's inscriptions and reliefs in the 1920s under the direction of James Henry Breasted. The Epigraphic Survey, which has been operating continuously for more than a century, has produced a series of definitive publications that record every inscription, every relief, and every architectural detail at the site, a comprehensive documentation project that is one of the most ambitious and most successful in the history of Egyptology. Breasted, who founded the Oriental Institute and who is often called the father of American Egyptology, recognized that the reliefs at Medinet Habu were deteriorating, that the painted surfaces were fading, the carved details were eroding, and the inscriptions were becoming increasingly difficult to read. He established the Epigraphic Survey to record the temple's decoration before it was lost, to produce a permanent record, in drawings and photographs, of every decorated surface in the temple. The project has been ongoing for more than a century, and its publications, large format volumes containing detailed line drawings and photographs of the temple's reliefs, are the standard reference for any scholar studying the temple. The Epigraphic Survey's documentation has revealed details that are not visible to the casual visitor, subtle variations in the carving technique, traces of paint that are invisible to the naked eye, inscriptions that have been partially erased or overwritten by later additions. The documentation has also revealed the extent of the temple's post-pharaonic modifications, the Coptic alterations, the Islamic reuse, the 19th century clearances, providing a comprehensive history of the temple's use and reuse over 3,000 years. The first pylon at Medinet Habu, the massive entrance gateway that dominates the temple's eastern facade, is one of the largest and best preserved pylons in the Theban necropolis. The pylon is roughly 25 meters high and 63 meters wide, and its surfaces are decorated with colossal reliefs, showing Ramesses III smiting enemies and making offerings to the gods. The scale of the reliefs is impressive. The pharaoh's figure, at the center of the smiting scene, is more than 10 meters tall, dominating the composition with a visual authority that is enhanced by the pylon's massive proportions. The smiting scenes on the first pylon follow the traditional Egyptian formula. The pharaoh grasping a group of captive enemies by the hair, raising his mace to strike, performing the ritual destruction of chaos before the approving gaze of the gods. The formula had been in use for more than 2,000 years by the time the Medinet Habu pylon was carved. It appears on the earliest known examples of pharaonic art, including the Nama palette from around 3100 BC. The repetition of the formula across 2 millennia of Egyptian art is evidence of the extraordinary conservatism of Egyptian visual culture. The commitment to traditional forms, traditional compositions, and traditional iconography that characterized Egyptian art from its earliest to its latest periods. But the smiting scenes at Medinet Habu are not merely repetitions of the formula. They are also specific, depicting specific enemies, the Sea Peoples, the Libyans, specific campaigns, the battles of the 5th, 8th, and 11th years, and specific outcomes, the defeat of the invaders, the capture of prisoners, the counting of the dead. The specificity is the Medinet Habu contribution to the formula, the insertion of historical content into a traditional form, the adaptation of a timeless composition to a specific historical moment. The formula says, the pharaoh destroys chaos. The Medinet Habu version says, the pharaoh destroys the Sea Peoples. The formula is timeless, the content is historical, and the combination, the timeless formula with the historical content, produces a composition that is simultaneously mythological and documentary, theological and factual, eternal and specific. The second courtyard at Medinet Habu, the space that contains the Sea People's battle reliefs, is architecturally distinctive for its combination of Osirid pillars and columns. The pillars, with their attached statues of Ramesses in the Osirid posture, line the southern side of the courtyard. The columns, with their papyrus bud capitals, line the northern side. The contrast between the two, the solemn, wrapped body Osirid figures on one side, the elegant, botanical columns on the other, creates a visual dialogue between death and life, between the afterlife and the living world, between the pharaoh as Osiris and the pharaoh as Horus. The dialogue is architectural, it is also theological, and the courtyard, the space in which the dialogue takes place, is the setting for the most important reliefs at the site, the reliefs that record the pharaoh's greatest military achievement. The Sea People's reliefs in the second courtyard have been studied by scholars from multiple disciplines: Egyptologists, military historians, naval archaeologists, art historians, and Bronze Age specialists. Each discipline brings a different perspective to the reliefs. The Egyptologist reads the hieroglyphic texts and interprets the theological content. The military historian analyses the tactical details and reconstructs the course of the battle. The naval archaeologist studies the ships and evaluates the naval technology. The art historian examines the compositional structure and evaluates the artistic quality. And the Bronze Age specialist places the battle in the broader context of the Bronze Age collapse, connecting the Medinet Habu reliefs to the archaeological evidence from across the Eastern Mediterranean. The interdisciplinary significance of the Sea People's reliefs is one of the reasons that Medinet Habu has attracted more scholarly attention than any other mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis. The reliefs are not merely Egyptian, they are Mediterranean. They document an event that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, that destroyed civilizations from Greece to Anatolia to Syria, and that reshaped the political and cultural geography of the ancient world. The Medinet Habu reliefs are, in this sense, the most important historical document at any Egyptian temple, not merely for Egyptian history, but for the history of the ancient world as a whole. The deeper truth of Medinet Habu is the truth about what happens after the victory, about the silence that follows the battle cry, about the decline that follows the triumph, about the long, slow collapse that no military victory, however decisive, can prevent. Ramesses III defeated the Sea Peoples. He saved Egypt. He preserved the last major civilization of the Bronze Age from the destruction that had consumed every other, and then, within a generation of his victory, the civilization he had saved began to collapse. Not from external attack, not from the Sea Peoples who had been defeated and dispersed, but from internal decay, from the economic failures, the administrative corruption, the political conspiracies, and the gradual erosion of royal authority that characterized the final decades of the New Kingdom. The workmen's strikes that occurred during the last years of Ramesses's reign were the first visible symptom of the internal decay. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, were accustomed to receiving their grain rations on a regular schedule. When the deliveries failed, they stopped working. The strikes were not revolutionary. They were not political. They were simply hungry men, demanding the food that had been promised to them. But the strikes revealed a systemic failure, the failure of the administrative system to deliver the basic resources that sustained the workforce, that sustained the pharaoh's most important building, projects. Let that sink in. The pharaoh who could defeat the Sea Peoples could not feed his own tomb builders. The military apparatus that could mobilize an army to save Egypt from invasion could not mobilize a grain shipment to feed the workers who were building the pharaoh's tomb. The gap between the military achievement and the administrative failure is the gap that defines the end of the New Kingdom, the gap between what Egypt could accomplish on the battlefield and what it could no longer accomplish in the granary. The assassination of Ramesses III compounded the administrative failure with a political crisis. The harem conspiracy, which resulted in the pharaoh's murder, demonstrated that the threat to Egypt was not merely external. The threat was internal, in the court, in the harem, in the very household of the pharaoh. The conspirators included members of the pharaoh's own family, his own servants, his own guards. The betrayal was comprehensive, and the message that the pharaoh's own household could be turned against him, that the fortress could be breached from within, was the most devastating revelation of the late New Kingdom. The examination of Ramesses III's mummy, conducted by modern forensic scientists using CT scanning and DNA analysis, confirmed the violence of his death. The scans revealed a deep wound to the pharaoh's throat, a slash that severed the major blood vessels, and that was, almost certainly, the cause of death. The wound was consistent with a knife or a blade. The assassination was not a poisoning or a smothering. It was a cutting, a violent, physical, bloody act that killed the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom in his own palace, behind the walls of the fortress temple that he had built to protect himself and his kingdom from the forces of destruction. This is not science fiction. This is forensic archaeology. The application of modern medical technology to the investigation of an ancient crime, producing results that are as disturbing as they are definitive. The pharaoh who defeated the Sea Peoples was murdered with a knife. The builder of the fortress temple was killed inside the fortress, and the temple, the building that was designed to sustain the pharaoh's cult for eternity, became instead a monument to the internal forces that destroyed the civilization it was built to protect. The harem conspiracy that resulted in the assassination of Ramesses III is documented in a series of judicial papyri, the most important of which is the Turin Judicial Papyrus, discovered in the 19th century and now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. The papyrus records the trial of the conspirators, more than 30 individuals, including members of the royal household, military officers, palace administrators, and the queen herself, Ta, who orchestrated the plot to place her son Pentuer on the throne. The conspiracy was elaborate. The plotters used a combination of poisoning, possibly physical attack, certainly the throat wound on the mummy, and magical assault. The papyrus records that wax figurines were made and spells were cast to weaken the pharaoh's defenses. The involvement of magical practitioners, men who were trained in the ritual arts and who used their knowledge to harm rather than protect the pharaoh, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the conspiracy. The same temple system that produced the priests who protected the pharaoh through daily ritual also produced the magicians who attacked him through magical practice. The system contained both forces, the protective and the destructive, and the conspiracy demonstrated that the destructive force could be turned against the very person that the system was designed to protect. The trial of the conspirators was conducted by a panel of judges, senior officials appointed by the dying or newly deceased pharaoh's successor. The punishments were severe. Some conspirators were executed, others were allowed to commit suicide, a form of punishment that was considered less dishonorable than execution, and others were mutilated. Their noses and ears were cut off, a punishment that was considered a form of social death, rendering the victim unrecognizable and unable to participate in public life. The trial records are the most detailed account of a political assassination trial in ancient Egyptian history, providing information about the conspirators' motives, their methods, their accomplices, and the punishments that were imposed. The CT scanning of Ramesses III's mummy in 2012 confirmed the forensic evidence of the assassination. The scan revealed a deep incision in the pharaoh's throat, a wound that was concealed by bandages during the mummification process, and that was not visible to earlier investigators who had examined the mummy with conventional methods. The wound was consistent with a slash from a sharp blade, a knife or a dagger, wielded with sufficient force to sever the major blood vessels of the neck. The wound was fatal. The pharaoh bled to death from a throat wound inflicted by an assassin who was close enough to reach the pharaoh's neck with a blade, a proximity that implies either a surprise attack or the involvement of someone who had legitimate access to the pharaoh's person. The DNA analysis, conducted alongside the CT scanning, identified a mummy that had been found in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari as a probable son of Ramesses III. The mummy, designated Unknown Man E, showed signs of a violent death, including evidence of strangulation or hanging, and its face was frozen in an expression that has been described as a scream. The mummy has been tentatively identified as Pentorwa, the prince whose mother, Djahy, had orchestrated the conspiracy, and who was presumably executed or forced to commit suicide after the conspiracy was discovered. If the identification is correct, the mummy represents the physical remains of the failed usurper, the prince who was supposed to benefit from his mother's crime, and who died, instead, as its consequence. The assassination of Ramesses III and the subsequent decline of the 20th dynasty transformed Medinet Habu from a mortuary temple into a fortress, from a sacred building designed for the performance of ritual into a defensive structure designed for the protection of the Theban population during periods of political chaos. The transformation was gradual. It occurred over centuries as the authority of the central government declined and the security of the Theban region deteriorated. By the late 20th dynasty, the mortuary temples of the West Bank, including Medinet Habu, the Ramesseum, and the Temple of Amenhotep III, were being used as administrative centers and as refuges for the population during Libyan raids. By the Third Intermediate Period, Medinet Habu's enclosure wall had become the primary defensive perimeter for the Theban community on the West Bank. The Coptic town of Djahy, the Christian settlement that was built within the Medinet Habu temple precinct during the early centuries of the Common Era, is one of the most important post-pharaonic features at the site. The town, which occupied the temple complex from roughly the 6th to the 9th centuries, was a functioning community, a village of houses, workshops, churches, and public spaces, built within and around the pharaonic structures, using the temple's stone walls as foundations and its open courtyards as building lots. The town's churches were built within the temple precinct. One of them was constructed in the second courtyard, between the Osirid pillars, using the pharaonic reliefs as the backdrop for Christian worship. The Osirid pillars, which depicted Ramesses III, in the wrapped body posture of the dead god, were partially cut away to accommodate the church's architecture, destroying the lower portions of the pillar statues that were considered inappropriate for a Christian building. The destruction of the Osirid pillars by the Coptic inhabitants is one of the most visible examples of the selective destruction that characterized the Christian reuse of pharaonic monuments throughout Egypt. The Christians did not destroy the temple completely. They did not demolish the walls or tear down the pylons. They selectively removed or defaced the elements that they considered most offensive: the images of the pagan gods, the faces of the divine figures, the Osirid pillars that depicted the pharaoh as a dead pagan deity. The selective destruction preserved the architecture while eliminating the imagery, leaving the building standing but stripping it of its original theological content. The clearance of the Coptic settlement in the late 19th century, conducted by archaeologists who removed the later structures to reveal the pharaonic temple beneath, was itself a form of selective destruction. The archaeologists valued the pharaonic temple. They did not value the Coptic settlement. They removed the Coptic houses, the Coptic churches, the Coptic workshops, treating them as later additions that obscured the original monument. The removal was thorough. Today, virtually nothing remains of the Coptic town of Djahy above ground level. The 3 centuries of Coptic occupation have been erased, their physical remains removed, their architectural contributions demolished, their presence at the site reduced to a few lines in archaeological reports and a scattering of Coptic graffiti on the pharaonic walls. The erasure of the Coptic settlement raises questions about the ethics of archaeological clearance, questions that are as relevant today as they were in the 19th century. Which layer of history is the layer? Which period of occupation is the period? Which buildings deserve preservation and which deserve removal? The archaeologist who cleared Djahy made a judgment. The pharaonic temple was more important than the Coptic settlement. The judgment was not unreasonable. The pharaonic temple is older, rarer, and more artistically significant than the Coptic settlement. But the judgment was also a form of historical editing, a decision to privilege one period over another, to present the site as a pharaonic monument rather than as a multi-period complex, to erase the later history in order to reveal the earlier. The multi-period character of Medinet Habu, the fact that the site was used, reused, and occupied by successive communities over a period of more than 3,000 years, is one of its most significant qualities, and one that the 19th century clearance largely obscured. The site was sacred before Ramesses, the 18th dynasty temple of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, which still stands within the precinct, predates Ramesses III's temple by more than 3 centuries. The site was occupied after Ramesses. The Coptic town of Djahy, which flourished within the precinct for 3 centuries, postdates the pharaonic period by more than a millennium. The site has been continuously significant as a temple, a fortress, a town, and an archaeological monument for more than 3,500 years. The temple's survival through all of these periods, pharaonic, Ptolemaic, Roman, Coptic, Islamic, and modern, is evidence of its durability and its adaptability. The building has survived because it was built to survive. Its stone construction, its massive enclosure wall, its elevated position, and its defensible plan have provided the physical protection that has preserved the building through 31 centuries of use and reuse. But the building has also survived because it was useful, because each successive community found a use for it, because the fortress walls that protected the pharaoh's cult also protected the Theban refugees, because the courtyards that hosted pharaonic rituals also hosted Coptic churches, because the building's adaptability ensured that it was valued, maintained, and preserved by every community that occupied it. The adaptability is the key. The temples that were too specialized, too specifically designed for a single function, too closely identified with a single pharaoh's cult, were abandoned when the cult ceased and left to the forces of destruction. The temples that were adaptable, that could serve new functions, that could house new communities, that could accommodate new religious practices, were preserved because their continued use ensured their continued maintenance. Medinet Habu was adaptable. The fortress design that Ramesses had intended as a military precaution turned out to be a preservation strategy. The walls that protected against invasion also protected against erosion, against quarrying, against the slow, patient, relentless forces of destruction that consumed the less protected temples of the Theban necropolis. The Bronze Age collapse. The catastrophe that the Medinet Habu reliefs document is one of the most debated events in the history of the ancient world. The collapse, which occurred roughly between 1200 and 1150 BC, destroyed or severely damaged virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean palace civilizations, the Kassite kingdom of Babylon, the trading cities of the Levantine coast, and the smaller kingdoms and city-states that had participated in the international system of the Late Bronze Age. The collapse was comprehensive. It affected every major civilization in the region. It was rapid. It occurred within a period of roughly 50 years. And it was catastrophic. The civilizations that collapsed did not recover. The world that followed the collapse, the Iron Age, was fundamentally different from the world that preceded it. The theories that have been proposed to explain the collapse include systemic failure. The argument that the interconnected civilizational system of the Late Bronze Age was inherently fragile, dependent on the continued functioning of every component, and vulnerable to cascade failure when any one component failed. Drought. The argument that a prolonged period of reduced rainfall undermined agricultural production across the region, producing famine, social unrest, and political instability. Earthquake. The argument that a series of devastating earthquakes, an earthquake storm, destroyed multiple cities simultaneously, disrupting the trade networks and the political structures that held the system together. And invasion. The argument that the sea peoples, whose campaigns are documented at Medinet Habu, were the primary agents of destruction, sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean like a military tsunami and destroying everything in their path. The current scholarly consensus, if there is one, is that no single factor was responsible. The collapse was caused by a combination of factors: drought, earthquake, invasion, internal revolt, and systemic fragility, that interacted in complex ways to produce a catastrophe that was greater than any of its individual causes. The sea peoples were not the sole cause of the collapse. They were one cause among many, a contributing factor rather than a sufficient one. The collapse would probably have occurred even without the sea peoples. The drought, the earthquakes, and the internal social pressures were sufficient to undermine the system. But the sea peoples accelerated the collapse. They pushed an already fragile system over the edge. They delivered the killing blow to civilizations that were already weakened. They provided the military force that completed the destruction that the other factors had begun. Ramesses III's victory over the sea peoples, then, was not a victory that prevented the collapse. The collapse had already occurred. The Hittites were already destroyed. The Mycenaeans were already fallen. The Levantine cities were already sacked. Ramesses' victory was a victory that prevented the collapse from reaching Egypt, that stopped the sea peoples at the Egyptian border, that preserved the Egyptian state from the destruction that had consumed every other civilization in the region. The victory was defensive, not offensive. It saved Egypt. It did not save the Bronze Age. The naval battle that is depicted on the walls of Medinet Habu, the Battle of the Delta, was, in tactical terms, an ambush. The sea people's fleet, sailing along the coast toward the Nile Delta, was lured into the narrow channels of the delta's waterways, where the larger Egyptian fleet was waiting. The Egyptian strategy was simple and effective. The narrow channels neutralized the sea people's advantage in open sea seamanship. The Egyptian archers on the riverbanks provided concentrated missile fire that the enemy ships could not avoid, and the Egyptian warships, lighter and more maneuverable than the sea people's sailing vessels, could ram and capsize the enemy ships in the confined waters. The reliefs show the Egyptian tactics with remarkable clarity. The Egyptian archers are depicted standing on the ship's decks and on the riverbanks, firing coordinated volleys of arrows into the enemy vessels. The arrows are depicted as dense clusters, not individual missiles, but walls of arrows, flying simultaneously, converging on the enemy ships from multiple directions. The effect is devastating. The Sea People's sailors are shown falling from the rigging, collapsing on the decks, tumbling into the water. The enemy ships, deprived of their crews, are rammed by the Egyptian vessels and capsized. The depiction of the capsized ships is one of the most vivid elements of the naval battle reliefs. The Egyptian artists show the enemy vessels overturned, their hulls rising from the water, their rigging tangled, their crews struggling in the waves. The capsized ships are surrounded by drowning men, figures shown in the water, their arms flailing, their faces turned upward, gasping for air. Egyptian soldiers, standing in the shallows or leaning from the decks of their ships, are shown pulling the drowning men from the water, not to rescue them, but to kill them. The drowning men are dragged from the water and killed with knives or clubs, their bodies added to the count of the enemy dead. The counting of the dead, depicted in a separate scene on the same wall, is one of the most distinctive elements of Egyptian military art. The Egyptians counted their dead not by counting bodies, but by counting hands. After the battle, the severed right hands of the enemy dead were collected, piled in front of the pharaoh, and counted by scribes. The count was recorded. The number of enemy dead calculated from the number of severed hands, and the total was inscribed on the temple wall as a record of the pharaoh's military achievement. The Medinet Habu reliefs show the hand counting in progress. The scribes, seated before piles of severed hands, their reed pens in their hands, their papyrus scrolls unrolled before them, recording the tally of the dead. The hand-counting ritual is disturbing to modern sensibilities. The systematic mutilation of the enemy dead, the collection of body parts as trophies, the bureaucratic recording of human destruction. But the ritual was not, in the Egyptian understanding, an act of gratuitous violence. It was a liturgical act, a ritual performance of the pharaoh's victory over the forces of chaos, a physical demonstration of the cosmic order's triumph over the cosmic threat, a concrete expression of the theological principle that the pharaoh's role was to destroy the enemies of Ma'at and to maintain the balance that sustained the world. The principle is the same principle that underlies every element of the Medinet Habu temple, the principle of Ma'at, of cosmic order, of the pharaoh's role as the maintainer of the balance between order and chaos. The battle reliefs are not merely historical records, they are theological statements, visual declarations that the pharaoh has fulfilled his cosmic role, that the enemies of order have been destroyed, that the balance has been maintained, and that the world continues to exist because the pharaoh has done what the pharaoh is supposed to do: destroy chaos. The temple is the monument to this principle. The fortress walls embody the principle. They protect the inner order from the outer chaos. The battle reliefs illustrate the principle. They show the pharaoh destroying the enemies of order. The osiride pillars represent the principle. They show the pharaoh transformed into the god of the dead, ruling the world beyond the grave with the same authority he exercised in the world of the living. And the sanctuary, the innermost chamber, the darkest room, the most sacred space, is the center of the principle, the place where the order is maintained, the place where the balance is sustained, the place where the pharaoh, living and dead, performs the daily ritual that keeps the world in existence. The daily ritual has ceased, the priesthood has dispersed, the offerings have stopped, the sanctuary is empty. But the principle of Ma'at, of order against chaos, of the pharaoh's cosmic role as the defender of civilization, is still inscribed on the walls, still carved in sunk relief, still painted in the colors of 3,100 years ago, still telling the story of the last great pharaoh who fulfilled the role, still testifying in stone and paint and carved hieroglyph to the moment when the forces of chaos swept across the eastern Mediterranean and were stopped, not by nature, not by chance, not by the automatic operation of some impersonal historical force, but by a pharaoh, a mortal man standing in a chariot, firing a bow, calling on the gods, and winning a battle that saved the last functioning civilization of the Bronze Age. The man is dead, the bow is broken, the chariot is dust, but the temple stands, the walls endure, the reliefs speak, and the story of the pharaoh who saved Egypt and built a fortress to prove it, is still there, still legible, still vivid, still after 3,100 years, telling the truth about what happened when the Bronze Age ended, and one man, one pharaoh, one mortal king with a bow and a prayer stood between civilization and the void. Stand in the second courtyard of Medinet Habu and look at the Sea People's reliefs. The scenes are carved in sunk relief, bold, deep, dramatic, and they retain traces of their original paint. The Egyptian soldiers are depicted in red-brown skin tones, their white kilts vivid against the stone. The Sea Peoples are depicted with lighter skin tones, their feathered headdresses and horned helmets distinguishing them from the Egyptian warriors. The ships are rendered in detail, the rigging, the sails, the oars, the prows carved with animal heads. The water is depicted as a field of zigzag lines, filled with the bodies of drowning sailors, capsized vessels, and the debris of the defeated fleet. The reliefs are propaganda. They present the battle as a glorious Egyptian victory, a personal triumph of the pharaoh over the forces of chaos. But the reliefs are also history, the most detailed visual record of the Bronze Age collapse that survives from any source. The Sea People's reliefs at Medinet Habu are the primary evidence for one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the ancient world, the collapse of the interconnected civilizational system that had sustained the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Hittite Empire fell, the Mycenaean palaces burned, the cities of the Levantine coast were sacked, the trade networks that connected Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia were severed. The Bronze Age ended, and the only detailed visual record of the forces that ended it, the only pictures of the Sea Peoples, of their ships, of their weapons, of their fighting techniques, is carved on the walls of a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile. The reliefs tell us what the texts cannot. They show us the faces of the Sea Peoples, or at least the Egyptian artists' representations of their faces. They show us their clothing, their armor, their weapons. They show us their ships, high-prowed sailing vessels, different from the low, oar-driven warships of the Egyptians. They show us their families, the ox carts carrying women and children, the migrating population that accompanied the warrior host. The reliefs are not photographs. They are not objective representations. They are Egyptian propaganda, produced by Egyptian artists, for an Egyptian audience, with an Egyptian political purpose. But they are the best evidence we have. And the evidence, however filtered through Egyptian artistic conventions, provides information about the Sea Peoples that is available from no other source. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains one of the most debated questions in Bronze Age archaeology. The Egyptian texts name several groups: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Veshesh, but the identification of these groups with known historical peoples is uncertain. The Peliset are generally identified with the Philistines, who settled on the coast of southern Canaan after their defeat by Ramesses, and who gave their name to the region, Palestine. The Jaka may be associated with the Teucrians of the Aegean. The Shekelesh may be connected to the Sicels of Sicily, but these identifications are tentative, based on linguistic similarities between the Egyptian names and the names of known peoples, similarities that may or may not reflect actual historical connections. The preservation of the Medinet Habu reliefs, the fact that they survive in legible condition with traces of their original color after more than 3,000 years, is itself one of the most significant facts about the temple. The preservation is a consequence of the temple's location on higher ground than the Ramesseum, above the level of the annual Nile flood, protected by the massive mud-brick enclosure wall that sheltered the temple from wind-blown sand and from human interference. The enclosure wall was the key, the thick, high, mud-brick barrier that separated the temple from the surrounding landscape, and that provided the physical protection that preserved the reliefs. The Coptic settlement that grew within the temple precinct during the early Christian period, the town of Djahy, which occupied the temple complex from roughly the 6th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, was itself a form of preservation. The Coptic inhabitants of Djahy built their houses within the enclosure wall, using the temple's stone structures as foundations and the temple's open spaces as building lots. The settlement was a village, a small, self-contained community, living within the walls of a pharaonic temple, worshipping in a Christian church that had been built within the temple precinct. using the pharaoh's fortress as their home. The occupation of the temple by the Coptic community was both destructive and protective. The Copts altered the temple, building walls, cutting doorways, removing Osirid pillars that they considered inappropriate for a Christian community. But they also protected the temple. Their presence within the enclosure wall prevented the quarrying and the vandalism that destroyed many other Theban monuments. The Copts were not conservators. They were residents. But their residence, lasting for roughly 3 centuries, shielded the temple from the worst effects of abandonment and neglect. The workmen's strikes of the late 20th dynasty, the first recorded labor strikes in history, provide a vivid picture of the economic crisis that was undermining the new kingdom during the final years of Ramesses III's reign and the reigns of his successors. The strikes, documented in papyri and ostraca from Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, located approximately 3 kilometers from Medinet Habu, occurred when the grain rations that the workers depended on for their survival failed to arrive. The workers, who were employed by the state to cut and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, were paid in kind, in regular deliveries of grain, beer, fish, and other foodstuffs from the royal granaries. When the deliveries failed, the workers organized. They stopped working. They marched to the mortuary temples on the West Bank, including Medinet, Habu, and staged sit-ins, demanding their back wages. The ostraca that document the strikes preserve the workers' grievances in their own words. Complaints about late payments, about insufficient rations, about corrupt officials who were diverting supplies for their own use. The complaints are specific, concrete, and angry. The words of hungry men who had been promised food and who had not received it. The strikes were not revolutionary. The workers did not challenge the pharaoh's authority. They did not question the system. They merely demanded that the system work, that the grain be delivered, that the rations be paid, that the promises be kept. The strikes were labor disputes, not political uprisings. But their occurrence, during the reign of the pharaoh who had defeated the Sea Peoples, who had saved Egypt from foreign invasion, who had built the most magnificent fortress temple on the West Bank, was a devastating indictment of the system's failure. The system that could mobilize an army to defeat the Sea Peoples could not mobilize a grain shipment to feed the tomb builders. The failure was administrative, not military, but the consequences were the same. The erosion of confidence, the loss of legitimacy, the gradual undermining of the authority that held the state together. The relationship between the strikes and the assassination is unclear. The papyri do not draw a direct connection between the economic failures and the harem conspiracy, but the timing is suggestive. The strikes occurred in the final decade of Ramesses's reign. The assassination occurred at the end of his reign. The economic failures that produced the strikes and the political conspiracy that produced the assassination may have been symptoms of the same underlying crisis. The crisis of a state that was losing its capacity to govern, to administer, to maintain the systems that sustained its population and its institutions. The position of Medinet Habu within the landscape of the Theban necropolis is, as has been noted, one of its most significant features. The temple is located on the southern edge of the necropolis, at the foot of the Theban hills, on ground that is slightly elevated above the floodplain. The elevation, just a few meters higher than the site of the Ramesseum, has been the primary factor in the temple's exceptional preservation. The higher ground means drier foundations, less flood damage, less salt crystallization, less stone degradation. The difference in elevation is small. The difference in preservation is enormous. The elevated position also contributed to the temple's defensive function. The temple's enclosure wall, built on the higher ground, commanded a view of the surrounding flood plain, allowing the defenders to see approaching threats and to organize their response before the attackers reached the wall. The combination of the enclosure wall and the elevated position made Medinet Habu the most defensible location on the West Bank, a fact that was appreciated not only by Ramesses III, who designed the temple as a fortress, but by the later populations who used the temple as a refuge during periods of political instability. The temple's defensive function was tested during the late 20th dynasty and the Third Intermediate period, when Libyan raids on the Theban region became increasingly frequent. The Theban population, facing threats that the weakened central government could not effectively counter, retreated within the walls of Medinet Habu, using the temple's enclosure wall as a defensive perimeter, using the temple's storerooms as emergency granaries, and using the temple's courtyards as living spaces for the displaced population. The temple was no longer merely a mortuary temple. It was a fortress, a functioning military installation, protecting the civilian population from the threats that the state could no longer manage. The transformation of the temple from a sacred space into a military refuge is documented in the administrative records of the Third Intermediate Period, papyri and ostraca that record the operations of the West Bank community within the Medinet Habu precinct. The records show a community under siege, rationing food, organizing defenses, maintaining order within the walls, while the countryside outside was subject to raids and instability. The records are the ancient equivalent of wartime dispatches, practical documents written by practical men managing a crisis with the resources available. The experience of the modern visitor at Medinet Habu is shaped by the temple's relative obscurity. Despite being the best preserved mortuary temple on the West Bank, Medinet Habu receives far fewer visitors than the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Hatshepsut, or Karnak. The lower visitor numbers are partly a matter of itinerary. Most tour groups have time for only 2 or 3 stops on the West Bank, and the Valley of the Kings and Deir el-Bahari are usually prioritized. But the lower visitor numbers are also an asset. The relative quiet of Medinet Habu, compared to the crowded Valley of the Kings, allows the visitor to experience the temple in something approaching the contemplative silence that the building's massive walls and its remote location were designed to produce. The visitors who do come to Medinet Habu consistently report that it is one of the most impressive and most atmospheric sites in the Theban necropolis. The combination of the Migdol Gate, the massive pylons, the battle reliefs, the painted interior surfaces, and the general state of preservation produces an experience that is, for many visitors, more powerful than the experience of the more famous but more damaged sites. The temple's walls are standing, the pylons are intact, the colors are visible, the battle scenes are legible, and the atmosphere of a fortress temple built by a warrior pharaoh on the edge of the desert at the end of an era is palpable. The atmosphere is the atmosphere of a building that was built to survive, and that has survived. The walls that Ramesses built to protect his temple from the Sea People's successors are the same walls that protect the temple today, from erosion, from vandalism, from the slow, patient forces of destruction that have consumed the less protected temples of the West Bank. The fortress that was designed to save Egypt has saved itself. The walls that were meant to shelter the Theban population now shelter the reliefs, the columns, the painted surfaces, and the 3,100-year-old record of the last great battle of the Bronze Age. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between military architecture and artistic preservation. We assume that fortresses are ugly, functional, utilitarian buildings designed for defense rather than for beauty. Medinet Habu proves that the assumption is wrong. The fortress is beautiful. The battle reliefs are artistic masterpieces. The painted surfaces are among the finest surviving examples of New Kingdom polychromatic decoration. The Migdol Gate is architecturally innovative, and the temple, the fortress temple, the building that was designed to resist attack, is, paradoxically, one of the most aesthetically satisfying buildings in the Theban necropolis. The beauty of Medinet Habu is not incidental to its military function. It is a consequence of it. The fortress walls that protected the temple from physical destruction also protected its artistic decoration from environmental degradation. The thick enclosure wall that sheltered the population from Libyan raids also sheltered the painted reliefs from wind-blown sand and from moisture. The elevated position that gave the defenders a tactical advantage also gave the temple's foundations a hydrological advantage, keeping them drier than the foundations of the temples on the flood plain. The military design and the artistic preservation are not separate qualities, they are aspects of the same design. The design of a pharaoh who understood that the best way to preserve his monument was to build it as a fortress. The pharaoh who understood this, Ramesses III, the warrior king, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, was also the pharaoh who was murdered inside the fortress he built. The fortress protected the temple. It did not protect the king. The walls held against the Libyans, against the Sea People's descendants, against the political chaos of the Third Intermediate Period, against the Coptic settlement, against the Islamic period, against 3,100 years of the forces that destroy everything. But the walls did not hold against the assassin's knife. The fortress was breached, not from outside, but from within, not by an army, but by a wife, not by a siege, but by a conspiracy. The irony is the temple's deepest truth. The fortress held, the king did not, the walls endured. The pharaoh was mortal. And the building, the fortress temple, the victory monument, the last great creation of the last great pharaoh, stands as a monument to both, to the endurance of stone, and to the mortality of the man who carved it. The preservation of the painted decoration at Medinet Habu deserves special attention because it provides one of the most complete pictures of the original appearance of a New Kingdom temple that survives from any site in Egypt. The painted surfaces, which cover the walls, the columns, the ceilings, and the lintels of the temple's interior spaces, retain their original color in many areas, providing information about the color scheme, the painting technique, and the aesthetic sensibility of the 20th dynasty artists who decorated the temple. The color scheme follows the standard Egyptian palette: reds, blues, yellows, greens, blacks, and whites, applied in combinations that were prescribed by tradition and that varied according to the theological significance of the subject. The skin of male figures is painted red-brown. The skin of female figures is painted yellow. The clothing is painted white. The sky is painted blue. The vegetation is painted green. The gold is painted yellow. The strict adherence to the color conventions, the same conventions that had been in use for more than 1,500 years, demonstrates the extraordinary conservatism of the Egyptian artistic tradition and the continuity of aesthetic values across the entire span of the New Kingdom. The painting technique was standardized. The artists first prepared the stone surface, smoothing it, applying a thin layer of gypsum plaster, and polishing the plaster to create a uniform white ground. The carving was then executed in the prepared surface. The reliefs were carved in sunk relief, the standard technique for Ramesses temple decoration, with the figures cut into the surface and the background left level. After the carving was complete, the painted decoration was applied. The colors were mixed from mineral pigments: red ochre, yellow ochre, Egyptian blue, malachite green, carbon black, gypsum white, and were applied in thin, even layers using fine brushes. The durability of the painted decoration at Medinet Habu, its survival over 3,100 years, is a product of several factors. First, the mineral pigments used by the Egyptian painters are inherently stable. They are not organic compounds that decompose over time, but mineral substances that retain their color indefinitely in the absence of chemical attack. Second, the temple's protected interior spaces, the hypostyle hall, the inner sanctuaries, the covered corridors, have shielded the painted surfaces from the direct sunlight that causes organic pigments to fade and from the moisture that causes all pigments to deteriorate. Third, the temple's elevated position has protected it from the flooding that destroyed painted surfaces at lower-lying sites. And fourth, the Coptic settlement that occupied the temple for 3 centuries may have inadvertently protected some surfaces by covering them with later construction that shielded them from weathering. The painted ceiling of the hypostyle hall, with its deep blue background, its golden stars, and its divine figures, is one of the most atmospheric spaces in the Theban necropolis. The ceiling creates the illusion of a night sky, the celestial dome arching above the visitor, the stars arranged in patterns that represent the constellations of the Egyptian sky, the divine figures floating in the blue like cosmic presences that inhabit the heavens. The illusion is enhanced by the dim light of the hypostyle hall, the columns casting shadows, the walls absorbing the light, the ceiling glowing faintly in the reflected light from the floor. The effect is immersive. The visitor is enveloped in the painted sky. surrounded by the stone columns, and immersed in an atmosphere that is simultaneously architectural and cosmic. The modern visitor experience at Medinet Habu is shaped by the temple's position as a secondary attraction on the West Bank itinerary, a site that most tour groups visit after the Valley of the Kings and Deir el-Bahari, if they visit it at all. The secondary status is undeserved. Medinet Habu is, by every objective measure, one of the most significant and most impressive monuments in the Theban necropolis. Its walls are better preserved than the Ramesseum's, its reliefs are more historically important than Hatshepsut's, its painted decoration is more vivid than Karnak's, and its defensive architecture is unique among Egyptian temples. The temple is a masterpiece, a building that combines military architecture, religious ritual, political propaganda, and artistic decoration in a synthesis that is unmatched at any other site in the Theban necropolis. The visitors who do make it to Medinet Habu consistently report that it is one of the highlights of their Egyptian experience, more impressive than they expected, more atmospheric than the more famous sites, more rewarding in its detail and its preservation than anything else on the West Bank. The combination of the Migdol Gate, the massive pylons, the Sea People's reliefs, the painted interior surfaces, the osiride pillars, and the general atmosphere of a fortress temple, a building that was designed to defend as well as to worship, produces an experience that is unique in the Theban necropolis. The atmosphere of Medinet Habu is different from the atmosphere of other Egyptian temples. Other temples are serene. Edfu is majestic. Dendera is mysterious. Philae is romantic. Medinet Habu is martial. Its fortress walls, its battle reliefs, its smiting scenes, its depictions of enemy dead communicate an atmosphere of military authority that is absent from the more peaceful temples. The atmosphere is intentional, designed by a pharaoh who had fought 3 major wars and who understood that the temple's function was not merely religious but defensive. The atmosphere says, this is not merely a temple, this is a fortress. This is a place where the pharaoh defended civilization against the forces that sought to destroy it. This is a place where the order was maintained, and the order, carved in stone, painted in color, depicted in the most detailed military reliefs in the ancient world, is still visible, still legible, still communicating the authority and the urgency that Ramesses III intended. The urgency is the quality that distinguishes Medinet Habu from every other temple in the Theban necropolis. Other temples communicate permanence, the calm, confident permanence of a civilization that believed it would last forever. Medinet Habu communicates urgency, the anxious, defensive urgency of a civilization that knew it was under threat, that had faced the most dangerous enemy in its history, and that had survived by the narrowest of margins. The fortress walls are not decorative, they are functional. The battle reliefs are not merely commemorative, they are warnings. And the temple, the entire temple, from the Migdol Gate to the sanctuary, is a building that was designed not merely to worship the gods, but to defend the civilization that worshipped them. The defense succeeded, the civilization survived, the temple endured. But the civilization, saved from the Sea Peoples by the pharaoh's military genius, could not save itself from the internal decay that followed the pharaoh's death. The new kingdom ended, the 3rd intermediate period began, the central government fragmented, the provincial authorities asserted their independence, and the temple, the fortress temple, the building that had protected Egypt from its greatest external threat, became the refuge for a diminished community that was seeking protection from threats that the departed pharaoh could no longer counter. The transition from victory monument to civilian refuge is the most poignant chapter in the temple's history. The building that was designed to commemorate a triumph became the shelter for a people in decline. The fortress that was built to protect a civilization at the height of its power became the refuge for the survivors of that civilization's collapse. The walls that Ramesses had built to resist the Sea Peoples sheltered, instead, the frightened inhabitants of a kingdom that was coming apart from within. The walls held. They held through the 3rd intermediate period. They held through the Libyan invasions. They held through the Coptic settlement. They held through the Islamic period. They held through the 19th century clearances. They held through the 20th century restoration. They held through the 21st century tourism. They have held for 3,100 years. And they hold still, massive, weathered, painted, inscribed with the record of the last great battle and the last great pharaoh and the last great era of the Egyptian civilization that built them. The walls hold, the colours endure, the reliefs speak, and the temple, the fortress temple of Ramesses III, the best preserved mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, the archive of the end of the Bronze Age, endures with them. The identity of the Sea Peoples, the question of who they were, where they came from, and why they migrated, has been one of the most contentious debates in Bronze Age archaeology for more than a century. The Egyptian texts at Medinet Habu name several constituent groups within the Sea Peoples Confederation: the Peliset, the Djahy, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others, but these names are Egyptian transliterations of foreign names, and their identification with known historical peoples is uncertain and contested. The Pelset are the most confidently identified group. They are almost universally equated with the Philistines, the people who settled on the southern coastal plain of Canaan after their defeat by Ramesses III, and who gave their name to the region known as Palestine. The archaeological evidence from Philistine sites in Israel, pottery, architecture, and dietary remains that show strong Aegean affinities, supports the identification and suggests that the Peliset originated in the Aegean region, possibly in Crete or in the western coast of Anatolia. The Djahy, who settled at the Levantine port of Dor after the battles, have been tentatively associated with the Teucrians, a people mentioned in Greek mythology as inhabitants of the region around Troy. The Shekelish have been associated with the Sicels, the pre-Greek inhabitants of Sicily, on the basis of the linguistic similarity between the names. The Denyen have been associated with the Danaans, one of the terms used by Homer to describe the Greeks, suggesting a connection to the Mycenaean world, and the Weshesh remain unidentified. Their name has not been convincingly connected to any known historical people. These identifications are tentative and debated. The linguistic similarities between the Egyptian names and the names of known peoples may be coincidental rather than causal. The Sea Peoples may have been a heterogeneous group, a coalition of displaced populations from multiple regions, united not by a common origin, but by a common predicament. The migrations that produced the Sea Peoples may have been driven by the same factors that caused the broader Bronze Age collapse: drought, earthquake, economic disruption, rather than by any single impulse or any single decision. The Medinet Habu reliefs show the Sea Peoples as a diverse group. Their headgear, their weapons, and their physical characteristics vary from scene to scene, suggesting that the Egyptian artists were depicting multiple distinct groups rather than a single homogeneous population. The feathered headdresses that are most commonly associated with the Sea Peoples are worn by some groups, but not by others. The horned helmets are worn by different groups. The round shields and the long swords are characteristic of some groups, but not of all. The diversity of the depictions supports the archaeological interpretation that the Sea Peoples were a coalition rather than a nation, a temporary alliance of displaced populations, bound together by circumstance rather than by identity. The ox carts that appear in the land battle scenes at Medinet Habu are one of the most significant details in the reliefs. The carts carry women and children, the families of the Sea Peoples warriors, travelling with the army, sharing the dangers of the campaign, participating in the migration that was as much a population movement as a military invasion. The presence of women and children in the battles indicates that the Sea Peoples were not merely a raiding force. They were a migrating population, moving with their families, seeking new land to settle, fighting their way through the existing civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The distinction between a raiding force and a migrating population is significant for understanding the nature of the Bronze Age collapse. A raiding force comes, destroys, and leaves. It does not settle. It does not establish new communities. It does not replace the population that it has displaced. A migrating population comes, destroys, and stays. It settles on the land. It establishes new communities. It replaces the displaced population with itself. The Sea Peoples, as depicted at Medinet Habu, were migrants, families on the move, seeking a new home, fighting to establish themselves in a region that was already occupied. The migration was violent, the settlement was permanent, and the Medinet Habu reliefs, showing the ox carts and the women and children alongside the warriors and the warships, document not merely a battle, but a demographic transformation. The replacement of one population by another, the rewriting of the ethnic and cultural map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III's defeat of the Sea Peoples prevented this demographic transformation from reaching Egypt. The Sea Peoples who survived the battles, particularly the Peliset and the Djahy, were settled by Ramesses on the southern coast of Canaan, where they established communities that would eventually become the Philistine cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The settlement was a deliberate Egyptian policy. The defeated peoples were given land in Canaan, which was under Egyptian control, in exchange for their submission to Egyptian authority. The policy was pragmatic. It converted a military threat into a buffer population, placing the defeated Sea Peoples between Egypt and any future threats from the north. The settlement of the Philistines in Canaan had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military context. The Philistines would become one of the most important peoples in the history of the Levant. Their cities would flourish for centuries. Their culture would blend Aegean and Levantine elements in a distinctive synthesis, and their conflicts with the neighboring Israelite kingdoms would be recorded in the Hebrew Bible as the defining struggle of the early Iron Age. The story of David and Goliath, perhaps the most famous single combat narrative in Western literature, is a story about the conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines, the people who had been defeated by Ramesses III and settled in Canaan by Egyptian policy. The connection between the Medinet Habu reliefs and the biblical narrative is one of the most fascinating threads in the history of the ancient Near East. The Sea Peoples who are depicted on the walls of Ramesses III's fortress temple. The feathered warriors, the women in the ox carts, the sailors in the high-prowed ships, are the ancestors of the Philistines who appear in the Hebrew Bible as the enemies of David and Solomon. The connection is not merely literary, it is archaeological. The pottery, the architecture, and the material culture of the early Philistine settlements in Canaan show clear Aegean affinities that confirm the Sea Peoples' Western Mediterranean origins, and that connect the Medinet Habu reliefs to the physical remains of the people they depict. The Medinet Habu reliefs are then not merely Egyptian history, they are Mediterranean history. They document an event that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, that produced the population movements that reshaped the ethnic and cultural geography of the Levant, and that set the stage for the Iron Age civilizations, Greek, Phoenician, Israelite, Philistine, that would dominate the region for the next millennium. The temple that contains these reliefs is not merely an Egyptian monument, it is a Mediterranean archive, a repository of information about one of the most transformative events in the history of the ancient world, preserved in the most durable medium available, on the walls of the most defensible building in the Theban necropolis. The archive endures, the walls hold, the colours fade but persist, the reliefs speak across 31 centuries, and the story they tell, the story of the end of the Bronze Age, of the migration of peoples, of the battle that saved Egypt, of the pharaoh who fought and won and was murdered, and whose fortress temple is the best preserved monument to the last great era of Egyptian civilization, is still there, still legible, still vital, still after everything, the most important historic document on the west bank of the Nile. The architectural innovation of the Migdol Gate at Medinet Habu deserves closer examination, because it represents one of the most significant examples of cross-cultural architectural influence in the ancient world. The Migdol, a fortified gateway modelled on the tower fortress architecture of the Levantine and Syrian military tradition, was an architectural type that was foreign to Egypt. Egyptian military architecture had its own traditions: the massive mud brick fortresses of the Nubian frontier, the defensive walls of the Delta garrisons, the fortified enclosure walls of the major temples. But the Migdol type, with its flanking towers, its narrow entrance passage, its defensive crenellations, and its multiple upper stories, was a Levantine innovation developed in the city-states of Syria and Canaan and encountered by Egyptian armies during their campaigns in the region. Ramesses III's decision to use the Migdol Poseidon for the entrance to his mortuary temple was a deliberate act of architectural appropriation. The adoption of a foreign architectural form for an Egyptian religious purpose, the appropriation was politically significant. It declared that the pharaoh had defeated the peoples who had invented the Migdol, that he had conquered their fortress type, that he had taken their architectural language and made it his own. The Migdol Gate was a trophy, an architectural souvenir of the pharaoh's military victories, displayed at the entrance to his most important temple, visible to everyone who approached the building. The gate's upper stories, the rooms above the gateway passage that were decorated with the intimate scenes of the pharaoh with female attendants, add a layer of complexity to the interpretation. The upper rooms were accessible only from within the temple precinct. They could not be reached from outside the enclosure wall. The rooms were therefore private, hidden from public view, accessible only to the pharaoh and his immediate entourage. The juxtaposition of the military exterior with the intimate interior, the fortress facade with the private chambers, suggests that the Migdol Gate served a dual function. It was simultaneously a defensive structure and a royal retreat, simultaneously a statement of military power and a space for private enjoyment. The dual function connects to the broader theme of the Medinet Habu complex, the combination of the military and the domestic, the sacred and the secular, the public and the private. The temple is a fortress, but it is also a palace. The royal palace, attached to the south side of the first courtyard, provided ceremonial and residential facilities for the pharaoh during his visits to the West Bank. The palace included a throne room, a suite of private chambers, and the window of appearances, the ceremonial balcony from which the pharaoh could appear to the crowds gathered in the courtyard below. The window of appearances was one of the most distinctive features of Ramesside royal architecture, a projecting structure positioned on the facade of the palace, overlooking the temple's first courtyard. The pharaoh would stand at the window, elevated above the crowd, framed by the architectural surround of the window, visible to everyone in the courtyard, and would address his subjects, reward loyal officials, distribute gold and other gifts, and display the captured enemies and the plundered goods of his military campaigns. The window was a stage, a platform for royal performance, designed to maximize the visual impact of the pharaoh's appearance and to project his authority over the assembled crowd. The combination of the temple, the palace, and the fortress within a single complex, the integration of sacred, domestic, and military functions in a single building, is the defining architectural characteristic of Medinet Habu and one of its most significant contributions to the history of ancient architecture. The complex is not merely a temple, it is not merely a palace, it is not merely a fortress. It is all three. A comprehensive institutional complex that served every function of the pharaoh's authority, from the performance of sacred rituals to the administration of justice, from the reception of foreign ambassadors to the defense of the civilian population against military threat. The comprehensiveness of the complex reflects the comprehensiveness of the pharaoh's role, his simultaneous function: priest, king, general, and judge. The temple served the priest, the palace served the king, the fortress served the general, and the courtyard, the public space where the pharaoh appeared at the window of appearances, served the judge. The complex was designed to accommodate all of these functions simultaneously, to provide the architectural infrastructure for a system of government in which sacred, secular, military, and judicial authority were concentrated in a single individual who exercised all of these forms of authority from a single location. The system concentrated power, the architecture expressed the concentration, and the temple, the building that housed the system, that provided the space for its operation, that embodied its principles in stone and mud brick and painted relief, was the physical expression of a political theory that had been developing for more than 1,500 years, and that reached its fullest architectural expression at Medinet Habu. The political theory was simple. The pharaoh is everything. The pharaoh is the priest who maintains the cosmic order. The pharaoh is the king who governs the state. The pharaoh is the general who defends the borders. The pharaoh is the judge who administers justice. The temple that houses the pharaoh must contain all of these functions, must provide the sacred space for the priest, the ceremonial space for the king, the defensive space for the general, and the judicial space for the judge. The theory produced a building type, the Ramesses mortuary temple, that was, in its comprehensiveness, in its integration of multiple functions within a single architectural framework, one of the most ambitious building types in the history of architecture. Medinet Habu is the finest surviving example of this building type, the most complete, most comprehensive, the most fully preserved expression of the Ramesses mortuary temple concept. The temple contains everything: the sacred, the domestic, the military, the judicial, the economic, the artistic. It is a complete world, a self-contained institution, capable of performing every function that the pharaoh's authority required, housed within a fortified precinct that protected the institutions from the threats that the pharaoh's authority was designed to counter. The world within the walls is complete. The world outside the walls has changed utterly, from pharaonic Egypt to Ptolemaic Egypt, to Roman Egypt, to Coptic Egypt, to Islamic Egypt, to modern Egypt. The changes have been comprehensive: political, religious, linguistic, cultural, demographic. Everything outside the walls has changed. Everything inside the walls, the stone reliefs, the painted surfaces, the architectural plan, the spatial relationships, the defensive walls, the sacred spaces, endures. The contrast between the change outside and the endurance inside is the most powerful experience that Medinet Habu offers to the modern visitor. The outside is the world of flux, of transformation, of the relentless change that transforms everything. The inside is the world of endurance, of preservation, of the stubborn refusal of stone and paint and carved hieroglyph to yield to the forces of time. The inside is winning, the fortress is holding, and the temple, the fortress temple, the best preserved building in the Theban necropolis, the archive of the end of the Bronze Age, continues to do what it was designed to do. It continues to endure. The religious calendar inscribed on the walls of Medinet Habu is one of the most important documents of Egyptian liturgical practice from the late New Kingdom. The calendar, carved in hieroglyphic text on the interior walls of the temple, lists the dates, the rituals, and the offerings associated with each major festival in the temple's annual cycle. The calendar is comprehensive. It covers the entire religious year, listing dozens of festivals, each with its specific date, its required offerings, and its prescribed rituals. The document provides information about the quantity and the type of offerings required for each festival, the exact number of cattle, geese, loaves of bread, jars of beer, bundles of vegetables, and other commodities that the temple's administrative staff was responsible for procuring and presenting. The calendar is not merely a liturgical document, it is an economic document, a record of the material resources that the temple consumed in the performance of its ritual program. The quantities are large, reflecting the scale of the temple's operations and the size of the community that depended on the temple for its livelihood. The calendar reveals that the temple consumed enormous quantities of food and drink in the course of a year, quantities that required the management of extensive agricultural estates, the operation of complex supply chains, and the employment of hundreds of workers in the production, transport, and preparation of the offerings. The Festival of Sokar, one of the most important festivals in the Medinet Habu calendar, was dedicated to the god Sokar, a funerary deity who was associated with the Memphite necropolis and who was, by the late New Kingdom, closely identified with the god Osiris. The festival involved a procession of the sacred bark of Sokar around the temple precinct, a ritual journey that replicated, in miniature, the journey of the sun through the underworld. The procession was accompanied by music, chanting, and the performance of sacred dances, a multi-sensory liturgical experience that engaged the entire community of priests, musicians, dancers, and worshippers who participated in the festival. The depiction of the Festival of Sokar on the walls of Medinet Habu includes scenes that provide detailed information about the festival's processional order, the ritual objects used in the ceremony, and the specific actions performed by the priests At each stage of the procession, the scenes are prescriptive. They describe how the festival should be performed, in what order, with what implements, using what texts. They are the liturgical manual for the festival of Sokar, a manual that was carved in stone on the walls of the temple where the festival was performed as a permanent record of the ritual program. The hunting scenes at Medinet Habu, depictions of Ramesses III hunting wild bulls and other game, add another dimension to the temple's decorative program. The hunting scenes are not merely recreational, they are theological. The pharaoh's hunt is a metaphor for his cosmic role as the destroyer of chaos. The wild bull represents the forces of disorder that the pharaoh is obligated to subdue, and the hunt represents the ritual action by which the forces of disorder are contained. The hunting scenes at Medinet Habu show the pharaoh in his chariot, charging into a herd of wild bulls, his spear raised, his horses at full gallop, the bulls scattering before him. The scenes are dynamic, energetic, and visually compelling. They combine the artistic qualities of the battle scenes with the theological symbolism of the ritual hunt. The equestrian scenes at Medinet Habu, depictions of the pharaoh on horseback, are among the earliest such scenes in Egyptian art and provide evidence for the increasing importance of cavalry in the late New Kingdom military. The Egyptian military had traditionally relied on chariots rather than on mounted horsemen, and the depiction of the pharaoh on horseback at Medinet Habu may reflect a transition in military technology, the gradual replacement of the chariot with the mounted warrior that would characterize the military forces of the Iron Age. The ongoing conservation work at Medinet Habu, conducted by Egyptian and international teams, focuses on the stabilization of structural elements, the conservation of painted surfaces, and the documentation of the temple's relief program. The conservation work is particularly important for the painted surfaces. The traces of original color that survive at Medinet Habu are among the most complete examples of New Kingdom temple painting in Egypt, and their preservation is a priority for the conservation teams. The work involves the careful consolidation of flaking paint, the stabilization of deteriorating plaster, and the application of protective coatings that slow the rate of pigment loss without altering the appearance of the painted surface. The conservation challenge at Medinet Habu is significant but manageable. The temple's elevated position, its thick enclosure wall, and its generally good state of preservation mean that the conservation interventions required are less dramatic than those needed at more damaged sites. The challenge is primarily one of maintenance, of keeping the existing surfaces in their current condition, of preventing further deterioration, of documenting every detail before the slow, inevitable forces of time erase what remains. The documentation is especially important. The pigments, however stable, are gradually fading. The carved details, however durable, are gradually softening. The inscriptions, however well preserved, are gradually becoming less legible. The process is slow, imperceptible on a human timescale, measurable only across decades and centuries. But the process is real, and the documentation, the photographs, the drawings, the publications of the epigraphic survey, is the permanent record that will preserve the temple's decoration even after the original has become illegible. The documentation is an act of preservation that parallels the temple's own function. Ramesses III built Medinet Habu to preserve his memory, to maintain his name, his image, his achievements in the permanent medium of carved stone. The epigraphic survey documents Medinet Habu to preserve the temple's decoration, to maintain the reliefs, the inscriptions, the painted surfaces in the permanent medium of published drawings and photographs. Both acts, pharaohs and the scholars, are responses to the same threat, the threat of oblivion, of erasure, of the slow, patient forces that consume everything that human beings create. The pharaoh responded with stone. The scholars respond with publication. Both responses are attempts to beat time, to create a record that will outlast the original, to produce a copy that will survive when the source has been destroyed. The pharaoh's stone has lasted 3,100 years. The scholars' publications will last longer, preserved in libraries, in digital archives, in the collective memory of a scholarly tradition that values the past and that invests significant resources in its preservation. The irony is that the most permanent medium is not stone, the material that the pharaoh chose for its durability, but paper and data, the materials that the scholars chose for their accessibility. The pharaoh's stone is slowly eroding. The scholars' publications are being digitized, backed up, and preserved in formats that will be accessible for centuries, perhaps millennia. The fortress is being outperformed by the library, and the temple, the fortress temple, the building that was designed to resist the forces of destruction, is being preserved in the end, not by its walls but by the scholars who document them. The walls endure, the documentation endures, and the combination, the physical endurance of the stone and the intellectual endurance of the documentation, ensures that Medinet Habu will be known, will be studied, will be understood, for as long as anyone cares to learn about the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the last great battle of the Bronze Age, and the last great temple of the era that built the civilization that built Egypt. So what is Medinet Habu? It is the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the king who defeated the Sea Peoples and saved Egypt from the Bronze Age collapse, and the pharaoh who was murdered by his own wife's conspiracy. The temple was built between roughly 1186 and 1155 BC, and it covers approximately 66,000 square meters. One of the largest temple complexes in the Theban necropolis. It is the best preserved mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile. Its walls still standing, its pylons still intact, its reliefs still legible and still retaining traces of their original color. The temple's walls contain the most detailed visual record of the Sea Peoples, the mysterious confederacy of raiders and migrants who destroyed the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and who were defeated by Ramesses III in a combined land and naval battle that is depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of the second courtyard. The reliefs are the primary evidence for the appearance, the equipment, and the military tactics of the Sea Peoples, a people who are otherwise known almost exclusively from textual references, and who remain one of the most enigmatic groups in the history of the ancient world. The temple was designed as a fortress as much as a temple. Its Migdol gate, its massive enclosure wall, and its defensible plan reflecting the military anxieties of a pharaoh who had fought 3 major wars and who understood that Egypt's security depended not merely on military victory, but on architectural preparedness. The fortress design was prescient. Within a century of Ramesses' death, the Theban population would seek shelter within the temple's walls during periods of Libyan invasion and political chaos, using the pharaoh's fortress temple as the refuge that he had intended it to be. The temple endures, the fortress stands, the reliefs speak, and the story they tell, the story of the last great battle of the Bronze Age, the story of the pharaoh who saved Egypt and was murdered for his trouble, the story of the civilization that survived the external threat but could not survive the internal decay, is still legible, still vivid, still painted in the colors that Ramesses' artists applied 3,100 years ago. The colors are fading, but they are still there. The reds are still red, the blues are still blue, the golden yellow of the pharaoh's skin is still golden. And the images, the Sea Peoples in their feathered helmets, the Egyptian archers on the riverbank, the capsized ships, the drowning sailors, the triumphant pharaoh standing in his chariot, are still visible, still telling the story of the day when a civilization was saved and the world was changed. The world was changed. The Bronze Age ended. The Sea Peoples were defeated but not destroyed. They dispersed, settled, became the Philistines, the Sicels, the peoples who would populate the coasts of the post-Bronze Age Mediterranean. Egypt survived. But Egypt was diminished, weakened by the wars, weakened by the internal decay, weakened by the assassination of the last great king who had held the kingdom together. The new kingdom ended. The third intermediate period began. And the temple, the fortress temple, the victory monument, the last great building of the last great era, endured. The temple endures because it was built to endure, built on high ground, built with thick walls, built with a fortress gate, built with an enclosure wall that protected the building from floods, from sand, from the slow destructive forces that consume the Ramesseum and the temple of Amenhotep III and every other mortuary temple that was built on the vulnerable flood plain. Medinet Habu was built to survive, and it has survived for 3,100 years, through the decline of the New Kingdom, through the fragmentation of the state, through the Libyan invasions, through the Coptic settlement, through the Islamic period, through the modern era. The fortress has held, the walls have stood, and the reliefs, the painted, carved, 3,100-year-old reliefs of the Sea People's battle, are still there, still telling their story, still, after everything, speaking.